On April 16th, a large farmhouse in the town of Rottenburg an der Fulda in Germany caught on fire and completely burned down overnight. Firefighters have yet to determine the cause of the blaze, but stated that it was possible that it was due to an arson. In any case, no one has lived there for a very long time. In fact, the local mayor was actually happy to see the building destroyed, because then hopefully it would mean that tourists would stop coming to their quiet little town just to check out the site. See, the last time this home was occupied was more than 2 decades ago, back at the end of 2002 when police made a surprise visit based on a tip they received from an Austrian student earlier during the summer. The young man had engaged in some disturbing conversation with someone online, and he decided to notify the authorities about the messages he received from whoever that person might have been. That started an investigation that would lead law enforcers all the way to this property, which belonged to Armin Meiwes, a 40-year-old computer repair technician, a native of Rottenburg an der Fulda, who had lived in this farmhouse for the majority of his life. He had been living there alone since his mother passed away a few years earlier. Inside, the search team found a giant freezer, and stashed away at the bottom of this freezer were packets of meat that the homeowner claimed was wild pig or some other animal. One of the police officers confronted him and said that she was a housewife, that she cooked regularly, and she knew for a fact that that was not animal meat in there. And so began to unravel a pile of evidence that would eventually leave this man sitting down in front of a camera in 2006, sharing his story from inside a German prison. Hi everyone, and welcome. So today's episode is indeed particularly gruesome, but I think on top of that, more importantly, from a legal perspective, from a psychological perspective, from an ethical perspective, it's also one of the strangest and most unique and most complex cases we've ever seen. And I don't mean just in Germany and across Europe, but probably in the entire world.
Armin Meiwes. I was born 1961. I'm computer engineer from Rothenburg, Germany. I killed a man, slaughtered him, and ate him.
Armin Meiwes was born December 1st, 1961, and raised in the countryside of central Germany, about 1 hour south of Kassel, the closest metropolitan city. Early on, he had a very much a typical childhood for a boy growing up on a farm. He would play with the animals, build tree houses, and chop down trees for fun. But most of all, his father actually had two other sons from another relationship. So early on, he grew up with two half-brothers, two older half-brothers, who took care of him and he really looked up to them. He basically loved them very much and vice versa. But unfortunately, late in the summer of 1969, when he was just 8 years old, his father would suddenly leave the family and never return. And shortly after that, his two half-brothers also left permanently.
Worst was the moment when my father left our family. My father simply drove away with the car. I was running after the car, wanting to stop him. I screamed, but he simply drove away, not even looking into the rear-view mirror. That was a very traumatic experience for me.
From that point forward, it was just Meiwes and his mother, and he felt extremely lonely all the time, longing for a sibling. Specifically, he wanted a younger brother that he could transfer his love to, the same way that he had received from his older half-brothers. Because he became so isolated and he had to establish his connection, he would develop an imaginary friend, an imaginary younger brother. During puberty, this desire for a brother would transform into not only having a sexual component, but this connection could only be achieved if the other person became a part of him, so to speak. In his mind, literally becoming a part of him. That's where his fetish for cannibalism began. In his early adult years, he joined the army, which gave him the chance to move away from home. He had a job to keep him busy. He had somewhat of a social life as he was around other people, around other young men. And he said his loneliness and his desire for cannibalism actually went away during this period. However, he wasn't able to hold down a long-term career in the army, so after 12 years, he moved back home with his mother. His mother had gotten into a car accident in 1996 that left her with permanent injuries. Meiwes would spend the next 3 years taking care of her around the clock until she passed away from a heart attack. After she passed, he was still a single man with no kids. He went on sailing trips with his friends. He was free to go out and do what he wanted now. But this also meant that now he had a lot of time to himself. He had the house all to himself. He didn't have anyone to bother him or control him or distract him or keep him busy. keep him busy away from his own thoughts. So now he was all alone with his own thoughts again. And those thoughts, those urges were starting to come back. Specifically, the urges to find a man that he could bond with and share with and connect with through cannibalism. And specifically, what he wanted was a man who would volunteer himself to be cannibalized. So this would be some type of situation, ritual, whatever you want to call it, that was consensual and mutual for both parties. So he actually wanted to go out and find someone that was willing to be basically murdered, because you have to be killed to be cannibalized. And he started searching for this type of partner on this new thing that was going on now called the internet. That was happening, in the late 90s, early 2000s. He would go on the internet pretty much every single night. He would go on the World Wide Web. He would be on forums and chat rooms that catered to those fascinated with death and sexual violence. These were literally websites where members can post ads requesting to be eaten or requesting to eat another person. Meiwes found hundreds of these ads, and he began responding to them, seeking a male participant whom he could cannibalize. He would chat with these men about his fantasies and about their fantasies. They would kind of discuss and exchange, and some of them he even met in person. So some of them he either hooked up with, or at the very least, they met in person. And what he did with at least one of them was he actually demonstrated what he would do to them in the process of cannibalism. He even told them how he would label the meat after he chopped up that person. So that's how far it actually went. But what Meiwes would learn in his encounters with these men was that actually each and every one of them, it was ultimately just all talk. For them, it was really just role playing, and it really was just a fantasy. It wasn't a fantasy that they actually want to live out, at least not the part of them actually being killed and cannibalized. So this was sort of disappointing to Meiwes because it wasn't fun to him because he wanted a victim or partner, so to speak, that was willing to go all the way. And that's all he wanted. He actually wanted only someone that was willing to sacrifice their life and their body, and someone who actually wanted to be butchered and eaten by him. So he had to continue on his search for that type of partner, and that's how he met a gentleman from Berlin, 43-year-old Bernd Jürgen Armando Brandes. When he was just 5 years old, Brandes's mother took her own life. And later on, when he was older, his relationship with his father unfortunately went downhill after he came out to his father. As an adult, just like Meiwes, he was a computer engineer with a stable career. On the outside, he had a clean, rather unassuming lifestyle, but privately had developed a sexual obsession that would be channeled through pain and torture. He had a friend named Jimmy, whom he paid for sex, but more specifically, according to Jimmy, in 1995, Brandes had him hold a knife against Brandes's penis and then asked to have it cut off. He also asked to have his penis bitten off, offering Jimmy a huge sum of money as well as all his computer equipment to fulfill these wishes. Brandes had posted these wishes on the Cannibal Cafe forum to find a partner who would amputate his genitals, for the both of them to then eat the remains together before further killing and dismembering him. In early 2001, Meiwes answered that ad, and on the morning of March 9th, 2001, they met in person at the railway station in Kassel.
We've been emailing and chatting on the internet since January, and we talked about exactly what would happen. Bernd had very bizarre ideas and guidelines how he had planned his end. When he actually stepped off the train, I was nervous and excited.
Meiwes picked up Brandes in Kassel and drove him back to the farmhouse in Rottenburg. At this point, based on previous discussions already, both men had agreed that everything that was about to take place, they would have it all recorded and videotaped. Years later, after Meiwes was sentenced to prison, his attorney, Harold Armin, gave film crews a walkthrough of the crime scene, describing step by step everything that happened that day. When the two men arrived on March 9th, 2001, they went into one of the dining rooms, and Brandes took off his clothes. Then they went upstairs to the second floor where the so-called slaughter room was located. They hung out on the bed up there, had sex, and talked a bit. But Brandes had some doubts about Meiwes. He was wondering if Meiwes was maybe a little too weak. He was wondering if he wasn't really strong or brave enough to go through with the plan. He was wondering if Meiwes really truly had it in him to actually ultimately butcher Brandes the way that he wanted to be butchered and cannibalized so badly. So they left the farmhouse. Brandes was going to take a train back to Berlin, but then they talked about it further and ended up picking up some sleeping pills. They figured if Brandes was a bit sedated, then Meiwes might be in a better position to inflict pain and injury on him. So they went back to the farmhouse again, and after they got back there, that's when Brandis swallowed 20 of the sleeping pills. And then at some point later, after 6 p.m., that's when he approached Meiwes and said, I'm anxious. I want to get this done. I want to get the deed done. So that's when they went upstairs to the slaughter room. Inside there was a big table. And then Brandis basically, he was naked. He put his penis on the table. And then Meiwes went to get a knife and he tried to cut the penis off. But that knife wasn't sharp or strong enough, so he had to go get a second knife. The second knife was, good enough. It got the job done. It was effective, and he pretty much amputated. He cut off the penis right away, and then Brandis screamed and shrieked in pain and agony because it hurt so much, and then he started bleeding out. So he basically screamed really loudly for about 30 seconds, and after that, apparently it didn't really hurt anymore, or it started to feel okay. And he told Meiwes that now, he's kind of fine. He was enjoying the experience. It was pleasurable. The only part was the pain was actually part of the pleasure for Brandis. And the fact that it didn't hurt anymore or it didn't hurt more than it did, that part was actually a disappointment for him. But in any case, so he had a wound down there now and it was open and it was bleeding and gushing out. And so basically from that point forward, for the rest of the night, Brandis would be bleeding nonstop.
Then he was screamed horribly, but relatively short, maybe for 20-30 seconds. The blood was quilting from the open wound, similar to a fountain.
And as a reminder, the video camera has been rolling the whole time. That means everything that I've described as far as what happened inside the house and everything that I'm about to describe, all of it was captured and recorded on a videotape. So what happened next was that Meiwes took the amputated genital downstairs to the kitchen and he washed it and then he cleaned it and then he sprinkled some garlic powder and salt and pepper on it and then he fried it and he brought it back upstairs to Brandis and then the two of them kind of tried to eat it and consume it and devour it. But it turned out that the meat was a little too tough and chewy and it basically wasn't edible for Brandis. So again, for this part, he was also disappointed. Then around 9 p.m., Meiwes started a hot bath and carried Brandis into the tub. He left him there and went into another room to read a book. At this point, though, Brandis was pretty much bleeding to death. At around midnight, he tried to climb out of the bathtub, but he was so weak that he fell right there on the spot and went unconscious. For the next couple of hours, he would wake up and collapse again repeatedly. Meiwes said he didn't really know what to do at this point. He thought about ending his life, but kept hesitating. Then he said he prayed and at around 3 a.m. finally took the knife and stabbed Brandis in the neck. Again, every step of the way, all of this was recorded on video. And according to that video, the victim fully consented to being murdered. Even drifting in and out of consciousness, he had lost so much blood, he was under the influence of 20 sleeping pills. Apparently, Bernd Jürgen Brandis voluntarily gave the okay for his own life to be taken. After that, Meiwes decapitated the body, and then he hung the body up against a hook that was in the slaughter room. He hung it and then dissected the body and removed all the internal organs, and he basically chopped up the remains and then put it in a freezer, put it in this giant freezer that he had downstairs. And he would store the meat there, and for the next about 10 months, he basically took the meat out periodically and basically had a meal with it to continue cannibalizing the remains. So every time he would eat some of Brandis's remains, he would basically prepare a meal in his dining room, in his fancy dining room, with a set of his fine china. He would light the candles. He would even enjoy it with a glass of red wine. So he did this for the rest of the year, and in total, he consumed almost about 45 pounds of his victim's remains. Meanwhile, Bert Brandis's boyfriend had reported him missing just 2 days after the disappearance. But there was no way to trace his communications or plans since Brandis had erased all the relevant files off of his computer and online accounts. Meiwes, on the other hand, remained active on the same fetish sites as before, advertising the same desires and seeking his next willing victim. In the summer of 2002, he was chatting with an Austrian student, letting him know that he already had experience cannibalizing someone. The student reported him to the police right away, and it would take law enforcement a few more months to identify the suspect, investigate him, and secure a search warrant of his home. On the morning of December 10th, 2002, Authorities raided his house in Rottenburg, confiscating several samples of the frozen meat, his computer, his video camera along with various videotapes, 3 knives, an axe, and a butcher's apron. In the garden, they found a skull, bones, and internal organs. From the very beginning, Armin Meiwes openly confessed to everything he did. However, he couldn't be charged or prosecuted for eating his victim, because Germany doesn't have any laws against cannibalism. As for the castration and the fatal stabbing, the defense team argued that it was all done because Brandes requested it. So there was no real victim because this is what the victim wanted. The jury had to sit through and watch through the video that Meiwes recorded. The entire taping was 4 hours long, but the court only played 19 minutes of footage, which was more than enough to make every viewer sick to their stomach. Now, the footage did demonstrate that everything that happened to Brandes, he did consent to all of that. He asked for it and wanted it, according to the footage. With that said, that footage also showed that Brandes was still alive at the time that Meiwes stuck the knife into his neck. That trial, which was handled by the court in Kassel, would end on January 30th, 2004. He was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 8.5 years in prison. In April of 2005, though, the case was revisited as prosecutors successfully appealed for a new trial. Judges at the federal level agreed that Kassel didn't do a sufficient job in the first trial, that they didn't take into consideration all the relevant theories and arguments. Specifically, the prosecutors would re-emphasize arguments claiming that Meiwes derived sexual pleasure from the entire process, which led to Brandes' death. And this gratification was proven by the videotaping itself, since he could relive his fantasy by watching the video again and again. This time, these theories would score a conviction of murder on May 10, 2006, resulting in a new sentence of a life term in prison. During his second conviction, psychiatrists provided their findings that the sexual and cannibalistic urges of this individual could never be contained. In other words, Armin Meiwes can never be cured or rehabilitated, and he will reoffend if he is ever let out. Those psychiatric opinions would be put to the test 12 years later when in 2018, the courts had to determine if this convict was eligible for early release. Apparently in Germany, it's common for lifetime sentences to be cut short and the inmate released after 15 years. But for Armin Meiwes, the court in Kassel and then later the state court in Frankfurt, they all agreed with the judges and doctors from the 2006 trial that this man was too dangerous to be let out with the rest of society. So Meiwes' appeal to be set free was officially declined, and he remains in prison to this day. And there you have it, the case of consensual cannibalism. There really is a thing such as that, as proven by the videotape and this whole case. It's definitely one of the most grisly cases that I've ever heard about or seen or read about and studied. But like I said, it really presented a very unique moral and legal dilemma. And that's kind of one of the main reasons I find this one so fascinating and, strange. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it and found it informative. And thanks for tuning in. I'll see you on the next episode.